What happens when a corrupt judge tries to scam Big Shaq and gets caught on a live stream? Why did an entire courtroom erupt, exposing years of injustice in one shocking moment? How did Shaq turn one traffic ticket into the downfall of an entire system? And most importantly, what did Shaq do that left a power-hungry judge in handcuffs, begging for mercy? This is the story of how one man fought back, exposed corruption, and changed the game forever. And trust me, you won't believe how it ends. Hey, real quick, before we get into this wild story, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. Where are you watching from? Shaq adjusted his tie as he stepped into the small, dimly lit courtroom, his towering frame nearly brushing against the low-hanging ceiling fan. Something felt off immediately. The wooden benches creaked under the weight of nervous townspeople, their hushed whispers blending into a low murmur. Eyes darted toward him, some filled with curiosity, others with silent warnings. From the corner of the room, a bailiff leaned against the judge's bench, his arms crossed and a smug smirk on his face. "Hope you got your checkbook ready, big guy," he sneered. Shaq raised an eyebrow. "Checkbook? For a speeding ticket?" The bailiff didn't respond, just let out a chuckle before stepping aside. That was when Shaq noticed it. No defense attorney, no court stenographer, just a judge's chair and a prosecutor who looked way too relaxed. This wasn't a normal courtroom. It was a setup. Before Shaq could say another word, the heavy wooden doors at the back swung open, and in strode Judge Gerald Whitman, a short, round man with thinning white hair, and a suit that looked 2 sizes too expensive for a small-town judge. He walked with a deliberate slowness, his polished shoes clicking against the tile floor. But it wasn't his entrance that made Shaq's stomach tighten. It was the way he was looking at him, like a lion that had just spotted an easy meal. Whitman took his seat, lacing his fingers together as he studied Shaq with a smirk. Well, look who decided to visit my humble courtroom." His voice dripped with condescension. Shaq didn't sit. He simply folded his arms. "I was under the impression I was here for a simple speeding ticket." The judge chuckled, shaking his head. "Oh, Mr. O'Neal, you'd be surprised how things work in my court. That ticket? Just the beginning." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. An old man leaned forward on the front bench, shaking his head slightly, as if warning Shaq to stay quiet and just go along with whatever was coming next. Shaq didn't like that. "All right," he said slowly, eyes locked onto the judge. "Then let's hear it. What exactly am I being accused of?" Whitman's smirk widened as he picked up a stack of papers and flipped through them dramatically. "Well, let's see. You were driving 15 miles over the speed limit. But that's not all. We're adding reckless driving, obstruction of justice, and, oh, this is my favorite, courtroom disruption fee." Shaq frowned. "Courtroom disruption? I just walked in here." The bailiff let out a laugh and the prosecutor smirked but stayed silent, letting the judge play his game. Whitman leaned forward, tapping his gavel lightly on the bench. "You see, Mr. O'Neal, justice in this town moves differently. And lucky for you, we have a simple solution. Pay $50,000 right now, and we'll forget the whole thing." The air in the room grew thick with tension. Shaq scanned the faces in the crowd. Some people looked away, others stared at their laps in silence. This wasn't the first time Whitman had pulled something like this. Shaq slowly exhaled and shook his head. 50 grand? For a traffic ticket? The judge shrugged. "If you don't like it, we can always move to jail time instead." A slow grin spread across Shaq's face, but there was no humor in it. "You must really think I'm stupid." Whitman's smirk faltered for the first time. Shaq turned his gaze to the silent prosecutor. "And you? You just let this happen?" The prosecutor simply shrugged, clearly unfazed. Shaq chuckled under his breath and took a step forward, placing both hands on the wooden defense table in front of him. "All right," he said smoothly. "Then let's make this a real trial." The courtroom fell silent. Even the bailiff shifted uncomfortably. Whitman's lips curled into an amused grin, but Shaq could see the hesitation creeping into his expression. "Excuse me?" Shaq reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "Let's see what my lawyer thinks about this." The judge's face stiffened. Shaq started dialing, and that was when Whitman paled. Judge Whitman leaned back in his chair, adjusting his robe with deliberate ease. His eyes gleamed with amusement as he scanned the room, but they settled on Shaq like a hunter locking onto its prey. "Ah," he said, his voice dripping with fake enthusiasm. "A celebrity in my courtroom. This should be fun." Shaq met his gaze without flinching. "Yeah, because from where I'm standing, it looks like a joke." The judge chuckled, shaking his head as if dealing with a child who just didn't get it. "Oh, Mr. O'Neal, I think you'll find that the law's no joke in my courtroom." He picked up a thick stack of papers and flipped through them dramatically, as if he were reviewing the case for the first time. "Now let's see. You came in here thinking you were dealing with a simple speeding ticket, but upon further review, I see there's more to it." Shaq's eyes narrowed. "More?" Whitman smirked. "Indeed. In addition to speeding, I'm adding reckless driving, obstruction of justice, and oh, this one's important, courtroom disruption." Shaq let out a small laugh, leaning forward. "Courtroom disruption? I just walked in here." The prosecutor, a thin, rat-faced man in an ill-fitting suit, folded his arms and nodded along. "Your presence alone is causing unnecessary commotion," he chimed in, barely containing his own smirk. Shaq glanced around at the crowd, nervous locals, a few snickering officials, and a bailiff who looked way too eager to see how this played out. The tension in the air thickened. The judge lifted his gavel, tapping it lightly against the bench. "And let's not forget the fines, of course. Now, considering your financial status, I'd say $50,000 should be more than fair to make all of this disappear." Shaq sat back in his chair, arms crossed. "You're serious?" Whitman's smirk widened. "Dead serious." A few gasps rippled through the room. One older man sitting in the front row shifted uncomfortably, gripping the edge of the bench. Shaq caught his eye, but the man quickly looked down, as if he knew exactly where this was going. Shaq exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Let me get this straight. You took a speeding ticket and turned it into a $50,000 shakedown? That's how things work around here." Whitman gave a lazy shrug. "It's simple. Pay the fine, and we all move on with our lives. Don't pay, and well, let's just say our little county jail could use a new high-profile guest." Shaq held his gaze for a long moment. Then slowly a grin spread across his face. "You must really think I'm stupid." The judge's smirk faltered ever so slightly. Shaq leaned in, voice dropping to a near whisper. "Here's the thing, Your Honor. I don't like games, and I sure as hell don't like being scammed." Whitman's fingers tightened around his gavel. "Watch yourself, Mr. O'Neal." Shaq didn't blink. "Nah, I think you should be the one watching yourself." The judge's expression darkened, and with an abrupt slam of the gavel, he declared, "Enough! 50,000, or we can throw you in jail." The room fell silent. Shaq simply smiled. "Yeah? Let's see you try." Shaq sat motionless for a moment, letting the judge's words hang in the air like a bad smell. Then slowly he crossed his arms over his massive chest and leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing at the corner of his lips. "You must think I'm stupid," he said, his deep voice slicing through the tense silence. The crowd shifted uneasily. A few nervous glances were exchanged. A man in the back adjusted his hat, looking toward the door like he was considering leaving. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. No one talked back to Judge Whitman. The judge's smirk faltered for the briefest moment before he recovered, tapping his gavel against the bench. "Careful, Mr. O'Neal," he said, voice laced with condescension. "You're already on thin ice." Shaq scoffed. "Thin ice? Man, I ain't even close to breaking a sweat." A hushed murmur swept through the room. This wasn't the usual routine. Normally, the accused paid up, accepted their punishment, and left with their tail between their legs. But Shaq wasn't playing by the rules. An elderly man sitting in the front row shook his head, whispering just loud enough for Shaq to hear. "No one fights back. It only gets worse." Shaq turned his head, looking at the old man with a raised eyebrow. "Y'all just let him do this." The old man pressed his lips together and looked down. A woman a few rows back fidgeted in her seat. "He owns this town," she muttered. "No one can stop him." Shaq let out a slow exhale, shaking his head. "Man, that's crazy." He turned his attention back to the judge. And what happens if I don't pay, huh? You gonna throw me in jail for driving 5 miles over the speed limit? Judge Whitman's smirk returned. For reckless driving, obstruction, and courtroom disruption, he corrected. And yes, I have every legal right to detain you. Shaq leaned forward, resting his massive forearms on the table. Cool, he said. Then let's make this a real trial. The judge's smile wavered. Excuse me? You heard me, Shaq gestured around the courtroom. Let's do this the right way. Evidence, witnesses, a jury even. You want to charge me? Then prove it. A few gasps rippled through the audience. Judge Whitman narrowed his eyes. I am the law in this courtroom, he snapped, and I don't need to prove a damn thing. Shaq chuckled. See? That's where you're wrong. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone. The room collectively inhaled as he held it up. Let's see what my lawyer thinks, Shaq said, tapping the screen. Judge Whitman's face turned an unnatural shade of pale. The entire room held its breath. Put that away, the bailiff barked, stepping forward. Shaq barely glanced at him. Yeah, no, that's not happening. He pressed the dial button. The call connected instantly. Yo, you busy? Shaq asked casually. A deep professional voice boomed from the speaker. Shaq? What's going on? Shaq smirked, eyes never leaving Whitman. Oh, not much. Just got caught up in a little small-town corruption. You know how it is. The judge gripped his gavel like a lifeline. Put that phone away now, he growled. Shaq grinned. Or what? You gonna add cell phone usage to my list of made-up crimes? The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. The judge looked ready to explode. But for the first time in years, he wasn't the one in control. And Shaq was just getting started. The moment Shaq lifted his phone to his ear, the bailiff lunged forward, snatching it right out of his hand. The courtroom gasped. No calls allowed, the bailiff barked, gripping the device like it was a stolen artifact. Shaq's eyes darkened as he slowly turned his head toward the bailiff. You just stole my phone? In a courtroom? His deep voice carried a weight that made even the walls seem to shrink. Judge Whitman chuckled from his bench, tapping his gavel lightly. Oh, Mr. O'Neal, he said, his grin widening. You don't seem to understand how things work here. Shaq exhaled sharply through his nose. Oh, I understand just fine, he said, sitting back in his chair, his massive frame making the wooden seat creak. You make up your own rules, shake people down for money, and when someone fights back, you shut them down. The judge leaned forward. That's right, he said smugly, because this is my courtroom, and in my courtroom, we play by my rules. A few people in the gallery exchanged nervous glances. They had seen this show before. Anyone who challenged Whitman lost. The local prosecutor, a wiry man with slick-back hair, adjusted his tie and cleared his throat. Your Honor, he said, standing up, given the defendant's disruptive behavior, I strongly recommend maximum fines. Judge Whitman nodded. Agreed. Mr. O'Neal, you're looking at an additional $20,000 for contempt of court. Shaq let out a deep chuckle, shaking his head. Let me get this straight, he said, stretching his long arms out across the table. I get fined for a speeding ticket. Then you add reckless driving. Then obstruction. Now for what? Calling my lawyer? That's another 20 grand? The judge smirked. You're catching on. The courtroom fell silent. The walls seemed to close in. Shaq glanced around at the people in the audience. The nervous old man, the mother clutching her son's hand, the young man chewing on his lip, all of them trapped in this rigged system. He could see it in their eyes. This wasn't just about him. This was about everybody who had ever walked into this courtroom and been bullied into submission. Shaq let out a slow breath, then leaned back in his chair, a knowing smirk curling at the edges of his lips. Cool, he said, nodding slightly. Then I guess it's my turn. Judge Whitman narrowed his eyes. Your turn? Shaq folded his hands together. Yeah, he said, his smirk widening. I let you all play your little game. Now it's time for mine. The judge stiffened. The prosecutor glanced at Whitman uncertainly. The bailiff, still clutching Shaq's phone, suddenly looked like he wished he'd stayed home that morning. Shaq cracked his knuckles. Let's see how much you like my rules. The courtroom was dead silent. Shaq sat back in his chair, arms crossed, a slow smirk spreading across his face. The judge's smug grin from earlier had faded just a little, but he was still confident, still in control. That was about to change. Shaq reached into his jacket and pulled out a second phone. He held it up casually, letting it catch the light. "Didn't see that coming, did you?" he said, raising an eyebrow. Judge Whitman's smirk vanished instantly. His jaw tightened. "What? What is that?" Shaq tapped the screen. "Oh, nothing much," he said. "Just a little insurance policy." The moment the phone lit up, a robotic voice chimed, "You are now live." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Whitman shot up from his chair. "Turn that off," he barked. Shaq just chuckled, shaking his head. "Nah, man," he said, tilting the phone toward the judge so the camera got a nice, clear shot. "Let's make this fair." The chat on the live stream exploded within seconds. "Wait, is that Shaq? Why does the judge look like he just saw a ghost? What kind of scam is going on in this courtroom?" Shaq turned the camera toward the packed gallery, showing the nervous faces of the people who had clearly been victims of this system for years. He wasn't just exposing a corrupt judge. He was giving them a voice. Judge Whitman's face turned red. "This is an illegal recording. Shut that off immediately." The bailiff, still clutching Shaq's first phone, looked helplessly at the judge, unsure what to do. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "You worried about something, Your Honor?" Shaq asked, his deep voice calm but laced with amusement. Whitman slammed his gavel. "I said turn it off." Shaq barely flinched. "Or what?" he asked. "You gonna find me again? Make up another fake charge?" More comments poured in. "Yo, someone Google this judge. This ain't his first time, I bet." Something about this feels sketchy as hell. Then, as if fate had decided to fast-track Whitman's downfall, a new comment appeared. "Wait, this guy's already under investigation." The moment Shaq read it, he grinned. "Huh, looks like I'm not the only one who thought you were dirty." The judge's face drained of color. "That's nonsense," he snapped. "Lies from the internet." Shaq raised an eyebrow. "You sure about that?" The courtroom doors suddenly burst open. Everyone turned as a group of state investigators strode in, their polished shoes echoing across the tile floor. The lead investigator, a woman in a navy blue suit, held up a folder. "Judge Whitman," she announced, her voice cool and professional. "We need to talk." The tension in the room shattered. The gallery erupted into whispers. The bailiff took a step back, looking like he wanted to disappear. The prosecutor hunched his shoulders, suddenly finding his notes very interesting. Shaq leaned back, watching the judge's world collapse in real time. "Man," he muttered, shaking his head, "you really thought you could play me." The lead investigator didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, flipping open a folder and pulling out a crisp sheet of paper. Her voice was steady, but the weight of her words sent a shockwave through the courtroom. "Judge Gerald Whitman," she announced, "we have a warrant for your arrest." The courtroom erupted. Gasps, murmurs, and even a few cheers filled the air. People who had been silent for years finally had something to say. Whitman's face twisted in disbelief. This is outrageous," he sputtered, his hands gripping the bench as if it was the only thing keeping him upright. Shaq leaned forward, his massive frame making the judge look even smaller. "Yeah," he said, his voice smooth. "So is charging me 50 grand for a traffic ticket." A ripple of laughter ran through the crowd. A woman near the back stood up. "He scammed me last year," she yelled, her voice shaking with anger. "He took everything from me." An older man next to her clenched his fists. "He raised my fine so high I lost my business." Suddenly, the courtroom became a storm of accusations. "He stole my land. He put my son in jail for a crime he didn't commit. This man ruined families." Whitman's eyes darted around, wild and panicked. "Order! Order in this court!" he bellowed, slamming his gavel over and over. But it was useless. For the first time, the courtroom wasn't afraid of him. The bailiff, the same one who had smugly taken Shaq's phone earlier, took a slow step backward. His grip loosened on his belt. He was realizing something. He had been on the wrong side. Whitman must have sensed it too because his tone suddenly changed. "Officer," he hissed, trying to regain control. "Arrest that man for disrupting court proceedings." He jabbed a trembling finger toward Shaq. The bailiff didn't move. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Officer, the lead investigator said, her tone carrying authority, you work for the state, not for him. I'd suggest you step aside. The bailiff hesitated. Then, without a word, he took another step back. Whitman's face turned a sickly shade of gray. His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Shaq tilted his head. Damn, he muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. Even your own people don't want to back you up. The investigator nodded to an officer near the entrance. Take him into custody. Whitman panicked. Wait, he cried, his voice breaking. You can't do this. I'm a judge. The officer stepped forward, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. Whitman took a step back, his back hitting the wooden panel of his bench. He looked around desperately. But this time, there was no one left to save him. Judge Whitman's hands were shaking. His grip tightened around his gavel, as if holding onto it could somehow save him. His face, usually smug and in control, was now pale, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. He slammed the gavel down, his voice cracking. Court dismissed. Nobody moved. The words that once held power over every person in this room now felt empty. Whitman's eyes darted toward the courtroom doors. His instincts screamed at him, run. With a sudden burst of movement, he shoved past his desk and bolted toward the exit. But an officer, standing tall and firm, stepped in his way. Not so fast, the lead investigator said, her expression unreadable. We have some questions first. Whitman skidded to a stop, his expensive shoes screeching against the polished floor. His breath was ragged, his chest rising and falling too fast. This is a misunderstanding, he snapped, forcing a dry laugh. You're making a huge mistake. I am a judge. You don't have the authority to do this. Shaq leaned against the defendant's table, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold with a smirk. That's funny, he mused, because 5 minutes ago, you sure acted like you had the authority to do whatever you wanted. The crowd murmured in agreement. People who had once feared Judge Whitman now watched him with satisfaction. The investigator took another step forward, unshaken by the judge's rambling. Gerald Whitman, you are under formal investigation for corruption, extortion, and abuse of judicial power. We recommend you cooperate. Whitman scoffed, trying to gather the last scraps of his confidence. This is absurd. Do you have any proof? Shaq's lips curled into a grin. Oh, we got proof. He lifted his phone, the one still streaming the entire courtroom. Thousands of viewers flooded the screen with comments. Exposed live. This dude is done. Call the feds. Somebody get the popcorn. Whitman's eyes locked onto the screen, his face draining of color. No! No! He turned wildly toward the prosecutor's bench. Martin, say something. Tell them this is all a mistake. The prosecutor, a man who had stood by Whitman's side for years, stayed silent. Even the bailiff, who once sneered at Shaq, now refused to meet Whitman's gaze. The judge realized it in real time. He had lost. The investigator tilted her head. You were saying, Judge? Whitman's lips trembled. His fingers twitched. He had spent years playing God in this courtroom, deciding people's fates with a single gavel strike. Now his fate was out of his hands. An officer unclipped his handcuffs, letting them dangle in front of Whitman's face. Then you won't mind answering our questions downtown, he said, his voice firm. For the first time in his entire career, Judge Whitman stood before a court, and he was the one on trial. The courtroom was no longer just a place of law. It had turned into a battlefield of long-buried frustrations. The air was thick with tension as Judge Whitman stood frozen, his once confident smirk replaced with a growing look of fear. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, escalating into full-blown outrage. A man in the back stood up, pointing a shaking finger at Whitman. You ruined my life, he shouted, his voice raw with emotion. I lost my entire business because of your bogus fines. A woman next to him clutched her purse, tears welling in her eyes. My grandmother lost her house. You let the bank take it over a $200 fine that wasn't even real. The room erupted in agreement. People who had remained silent for years finally had the chance to speak. Shaq leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, watching the downfall unfold. He had seen many corrupt people get exposed in his lifetime. But this was different. This was a community finally reclaiming its voice. Judge Whitman slammed his gavel desperately, his face red with frustration. Order! This is still my courtroom! But no one was listening anymore. The lead investigator stepped forward, holding up a thick folder. Actually, it's not. He turned to the officers. Judge Whitman, we have overwhelming evidence of financial fraud, judicial misconduct, and abuse of power. You are officially under investigation by the state. Whitman's face paled. Wait, hold on. You can't do this. His voice cracked. I am the law in this town. Shaq chuckled under his breath. Not anymore. The bailiff, who had once been Whitman's right-hand enforcer, slowly took a step back. It was clear he didn't want to go down with the sinking ship. Other court employees exchanged uneasy glances, realizing that the power dynamic had shifted completely. The murmurs in the crowd turned into applause. Some even pulled out their phones to record. This moment wasn't just about Shaq. This was about every person who had suffered under Whitman's corrupt rule. A young man in the front row, barely in his 20s, shook his head. Man, I got arrested last year for a parking ticket because of you. A parking ticket! The anger in the room was undeniable. Whitman looked around, searching for an escape, but there was none. The same people he had stepped on for years were now standing tall, while he shrank under the weight of his crimes. Shaq stretched his arms and let out a satisfied sigh. Damn, he said, shaking his head with amusement. Couldn't have happened to a better guy. Whitman turned to Shaq, desperation in his eyes. You! This is your fault! If you had just paid the fine and left... Shaq raised an eyebrow. Yeah, that's not really my style. The investigator nodded to the officers. Cuff him! The sound of metal clicking shut around Whitman's wrist was met with cheers. Justice had finally arrived, and for the first time in his life, Whitman was on the wrong side of the law. As the officers dragged Whitman toward the exit, he thrashed in protest. You haven't heard the last of me, he spat. But no one cared. The courtroom, once controlled by fear, was now filled with hope. And Shaq, he was just getting started. The moment the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, Judge Whitman's world began to crumble. But even with his back against the wall, he wasn't going down without a fight. You think you can do this to me? He snarled, his face twisted with rage. His eyes darted around the courtroom, searching for anyone who would back him up. But all he found were the cold stares of the people he had wronged. Then suddenly, he lunged. With one last act of desperation, he lunged straight at Shaq, his hands clawing for the phone in Shaq's grip. You ruined everything, he bellowed. I won't let you destroy me. Shaq barely moved. He simply took a step back, letting Whitman's momentum work against him. The once powerful judge stumbled forward, his knees slamming into the edge of his own bench. Two officers grabbed him immediately, yanking him backward and forcing him against the wooden bench where he had once sentenced so many innocent people. The irony was thick in the air. Get your hands off me, Whitman spat, thrashing against their hold. I am the law. Shaq tilted his head, watching the pathetic display. Nah, he said, slipping his phone into his pocket. You're just a guy who got caught. The lead investigator stepped forward, pulling out a thick folder. Gerald Whitman, he began, his voice steady and authoritative. You are officially under arrest for judicial corruption, fraud, and abuse of power. We have overwhelming evidence, including testimonies from numerous victims. The entire room was dead silent. All eyes were on Whitman, whose face was now drained of all color. You can't do this, he whispered, shaking his head in disbelief. I'm a judge. I'm protected. The investigator didn't even flinch. Not anymore. He nodded to the officers. Take him into custody. Whitman let out a strangled cry as they dragged him toward the exit, but his voice was drowned out by the sound of the courtroom erupting into cheers. One man, the same business owner who had spoken out earlier, laughed bitterly. Man, I wish I could have seen this years ago. A woman in the back shook her head. Took long enough, but at least he's finally getting what he deserves. Shaq simply smirked. Better late than never. As Whitman was hauled away, his face twisted in fury. He turned his head, locking eyes with Shaq one last time. You haven't heard the last of me, he growled. I'll find a way out of this. Shaq leaned against the bench, completely unfazed. Yeah, good luck with that. With that, the doors swung open, and Whitman was gone. The reign of corruption was over. But Shaq? He was just getting started. A week had passed since Judge Whitman was hauled out of his own courtroom in handcuffs, and the town was still buzzing. For years, people had whispered about the corruption that ran through the local justice system, but no one had dared to challenge it until Shaq walked in. Now standing on the steps of the very courthouse where Whitman once ruled with unchecked power, Shaq adjusted the microphone in front of him and scanned the crowd. Reporters, legal officials, and dozens of wronged citizens had gathered, eager to hear what he had to say. "Man," Shaq started, shaking his head with a grin, "when I came in here last week, I was just trying to handle a speeding ticket. Y'all didn't tell me I was stepping into a crime scene." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Even the new judge, a stern-looking woman who had just been appointed to replace Whitman, couldn't suppress a small smirk. "But in all seriousness," Shaq continued, his tone turning sincere, "justice isn't supposed to be about money. It's not about power. It's about doing the right thing, no matter who you are. The people in this town deserve better." Applause broke out, but Shaq raised a hand to quiet it. "And now they're going to get better," he said, "because the folks who were part of this mess, they're out." A reporter from the local news station stepped forward. "Can you confirm that the entire courthouse staff was investigated?" Shaq nodded. "Yep. And guess what? Half of them resigned before they could even be questioned. That tells you everything you need to know." A murmur of disbelief spread through the crowd. The level of corruption had been worse than many realized. The new judge stepped up beside Shaq. "I'd like to thank Mr. O'Neal for shining a light on the injustices that took place here," she said. "Because of his efforts, all cases overseen by Judge Whitman are now under review." This time the applause was thunderous. A man in the back, one of Whitman's former victims, shouted, "That's real justice?" Shaq chuckled. "Yeah, it is, but hold up. I got one last thing." The crowd fell silent, waiting. A reporter in a crisp suit raised his mic. "Shaq, what's next for you after this?" Shaq pretended to think for a second, then grinned. "I don't know," he said, rubbing his chin. "Maybe I should become a judge." Laughter erupted. Someone in the crowd shouted, "We'd vote for you." Shaq smirked, looking out over the cheering crowd. "You know, that might not be such a bad idea." The cameras flashed, the town finally at peace. But one thing was for sure. Shaq had just changed the system for good. The fluorescent lights above flickered with a dull hum, casting a sickly glow over the prison cafeteria. The air was thick with the scent of overcooked food and something stale that never quite went away. At one of the metal tables, Judge Gerald Whitman sat hunched over his untouched tray, his once pristine hands gripping the edge so tightly his knuckles had turned white. He wasn't Judge Whitman anymore, just inmate number 42,789. A guard strolled toward him, tapping a manila folder against his palm. "Hey, Whitman," the officer called, his voice thick with amusement. "Got some news for you." Whitman barely lifted his head. The past week had been hell. His fall from power had been swifter than he ever imagined. No luxury chambers, no gavel to slam, no courtroom to manipulate. Just cold cement, steel bars, and the same justice system he once twisted to his advantage, now turning against him. The guard flipped open the folder, pretending to scan the contents. "Looks like your case got reviewed." Whitman's throat felt dry. "Reviewed?" he croaked, his voice hoarse from days of silence. The guard's smirk widened. "Yeah, turns out all your rulings are overturned." The words slammed into Whitman's chest harder than any punch could. "All of them?" he rasped, his eyes darting up in disbelief. "Every single one," the guard confirmed, snapping the folder shut with a dramatic clap. "You're officially nobody now." A few inmates nearby overheard and snickered. "Damn, man," one muttered. "That's rough." Whitman clenched his jaw. He had spent years building his empire, bending the law to serve himself. He thought he was untouchable, but now everything had unraveled. Cases he had rigged, fines he had imposed, lives he had ruined, all of it undone. He had no more power, no more influence, just time, endless time to think about what he had lost. The guard tapped on the table. "Guess that means your little legacy's gone, huh?" He leaned in slightly. "I hear some of your old friends are scrambling. Without your rulings, they got to answer for a lot of dirty money." Whitman said nothing. What could he say? His allies had abandoned him the moment he was exposed. Anyway, the guard said, standing up straight, you got a visitor. Whitman frowned. A visitor? The guard smirked. Oh yeah, he left a little something for you. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope, placing it on the table before walking off. Whitman hesitated before picking it up, his fingers trembling. The moment he saw the handwriting on the front, his stomach twisted. It was from Shaquille O'Neal. His hands shook as he pulled out the note inside. I told you, real power isn't in a robe. It's in doing the right thing. Enjoy your stay. Whitman's breath came in short gasps as the reality of his situation crashed over him. His vision blurred. His chest felt tight. He wanted to scream, to lash out, but there was nothing left to fight. A loud clang echoed through the cafeteria as the heavy steel doors slammed shut for the night. Whitman buried his head in his hands, knowing deep down this was justice, and there was no escaping it. The sun shone brightly over the newly renovated courthouse, its sleek marble steps reflecting a justice system finally reborn. A month had passed since Judge Whitman's downfall, and now the very building where he had once abused his power was being reopened. This time, as a true symbol of justice. The crowd gathered outside was buzzing with excitement. News cameras flashed, journalists scrambled for the best shots, and former victims of Whitman's corrupt rulings stood proudly, ready to witness a new beginning. At the center of it all stood Shaquille O'Neal, towering above the podium, dressed in a sharp navy suit. He had been invited as a guest speaker, the man responsible for bringing down an empire of injustice. As he adjusted the mic, the crowd quieted. Shaq cleared his throat. A month ago, this courthouse was a place of fear, a place where people got cheated, where money mattered more than fairness. But today, he gestured around, today it's something else. Today, justice gets a fresh start. The crowd erupted into applause. Among them were dozens of people who had been wronged by Whitman, business owners whose livelihoods had been destroyed, families who had lost their homes, people who had been unfairly fined and bullied into silence. Now their voices were being heard. The newly appointed judge, a woman with decades of experience and an untarnished reputation, stood among them, nodding in agreement. She had been one of Whitman's fiercest critics, and now she would be the one to restore faith in the system. As the ceremony continued, a young man in his early 20s approached Shaq. He looked nervous, but his eyes were filled with determination. Mr. O'Neal, he said, clearing his throat, I just wanted to say, because of you, I'm studying to become a real judge. Shaq raised an eyebrow. Oh yeah? The young man nodded. Yeah. I used to believe the system was rigged, that people like me would never stand a chance. But when I saw you take Whitman down, I realized something. Power isn't about control, it's about responsibility, and I want to be part of the change. For a moment, Shaq just looked at him, then extended his massive hand. Then do it right, he said, shaking the young man's hand firmly. Power is only real if you use it for good. The crowd cheered again, their applause echoing across the courthouse steps. Cameras flashed as the moment was immortalized. As the ceremony wrapped up, Shaq took a step back, watching the people celebrate. He had done what he came to do. Justice had been restored, and the community had reclaimed its rights. But as he turned to leave, a news report played on a nearby screen. Breaking news. Former Judge Gerald Whitman has been sentenced to 20 years in prison for corruption, fraud, and abuse of power. Shaq smirked. Figures. Behind him, a familiar face was pushing a mop across the courthouse floor. One of Whitman's former bailiffs. The man glanced up at the screen, shaking his head. Man, he muttered to himself, karma's undefeated. Real power isn't in a robe, it's in doing the right thing.